They swore under oath that they had never laid a hand on him. But then the video dropped. What happened in that courtroom that day left the entire city reeling. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was taken. Every eye was locked on the small figure seated at the witness stand. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop the world from watching. Outside, the streets buzzed with reporters, their pens scratching furiously, legal teams whispering among themselves, and a crowd hungry for justice waiting on every word. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with something unspoken. Then Micah Turner spoke. "The cops beat me," he said. "I told them I couldn't breathe. They just kept going." He was 12 years old, small for his age, sitting in that massive wooden chair. His feet dangled inches above the polished floor. But his voice, it hit like a sledgehammer. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The judge, a man who had sat on that bench for nearly 30 years, exhaled slowly through his nose. His hand twitched at his glasses, but he didn't adjust them. The jury sat frozen, their faces a mix of disbelief, skepticism, and dawning realization. The officers at the defense table sat rigid, eyes darting between their lawyer and the boy they had sworn under oath they'd never touched. Micah swallowed hard. His fingers curled tight against the wooden arms of the chair, but he didn't cry. He wasn't even shaking. He just looked tired, exhausted in a way no child should ever be. "They threw me down," he said. My head hit the pavement. One of them put his knee on my neck. I kept saying, "Please stop." His voice didn't waver. He told it like it had happened, matter of fact, almost like he'd practiced it. Not because he wanted to, but because he had relived it so many times in his mind, it was burned there forever. His mother, Camille Turner, sat in the front row. Her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her lips pressed together so hard they almost disappeared, holding something back. Anger, grief, or maybe both. The defense attorney cleared his throat. Lawrence Tate was his name, a polished man in his mid-50s, expensive suit, silk tie, the kind of lawyer who made his living turning ugly things into reasonable misunderstandings. He leaned forward on the lectern. "Micah," he said smoothly, "are you sure you remember everything correctly?" It was dark, wasn't it? Micah didn't blink. "It wasn't dark," he said. "We were right under a streetlight." Tate shifted uncomfortably. He glanced down at his papers, his plan unraveling with each word the boy spoke. The judge adjusted himself in his chair. "Let's keep this moving, counselor." The tension didn't break. Not even for a second. Micah took a breath. He turned and looked straight at the jury. "They laughed when I stopped moving," he said. "One of them told me, 'Ain't no cameras here, kid.'" A beat of silence. One of the jurors, an older woman with silver hair, inhaled sharply. Somewhere in the back row of the gallery, someone whispered something too low to hear. The judge looked down over his glasses. "Do you have any further questions for the witness, counselor?" Lawrence Tate hesitated. "Not at this time, Your Honor." Micah exhaled slowly. He turned his head toward his mother. She gave him the smallest nod. He had done what he came here to do. What came next was out of his hands. But the truth, it had already cracked something open, and there was no stopping what was coming now. That courtroom felt like another world compared to that night. That night, the air had been thick, sticky, one of those summer nights where the heat made everything feel slower, heavier. It was like the whole city had been holding its breath. Micah had only been trying to get home. He'd been at his friend Leo's house, 2 blocks over, playing video games. His mom had called and told him to be home by 10. He wasn't going to be late. Not after the last time. He took the usual route. Oak Ridge Street, past the gas station, through the shortcut behind the old laundromat. He'd done it 100 times. Never had a problem. Until that night. The headlights hit him first. Bright. Blinding. A police car screeched to a stop just feet away. "Hey, stop right there." Micah froze. 2 officers jumped out, hands on their holsters, moving fast, like they were ready for something big, something dangerous. "Put your hands up," one of them barked. Micah obeyed. Fust. His heart slammed against his ribs. His arms shook as he raised them high above his head. "What did I do?" he stammered. "Shut up," the taller cop growled. Officer Rick Daniels. Shaved head, hard eyes. He walked toward Micah slowly at first, like he was sizing him up. The other cop, Officer Brent Holloway, stayed by the car, his hand resting on his gun. Micah looked around. The street was empty. His house was just past the corner, but it might as well have been a mile away. "What's in your pockets?" "Nothing," Micah said. "Turn around." Micah hesitated. Wrong move. Before he could say a word, Daniels grabbed him, spun him around, shoved him hard into the pavement. Pain exploded through Micah's cheek. The rough asphalt scraped his skin. His arms were twisted behind his back before he even knew what was happening. "I didn't do anything," he cried. His voice was shaking, strangled against the weight pressing him down. A knee drove into his back. "Hard." "You match the description," Daniels muttered. "What description?" "I'm just going home." A rough hand gripped his shoulder, shoved him harder into the ground. His ribs screamed. Then came the first punch. Sharp, sudden, to his side. Then another, and another. Micah's body curled inward, trying to protect himself. "Please," he whispered. But they didn't stop. His mouth filled with the metallic taste of blood. His vision blurred. He tried to move, but every time he did, a boot, a fist, something slammed him back down. "Ain't no cameras here, kid." That voice. Low. Almost amused. Micah felt something wet slide down his face. Blood. Sweat. Tears. Maybe all three. And then, just like that, it was over. The weight lifted. The hands pulled back. "Get up." Micah pushed himself onto his elbows, coughing. His chest burned. He tried to look up, but the streetlight stabbed into his eyes. "You're lucky," Daniels muttered. "Lucky." They got back into their car. The tires screeched as they sped away. Micah stayed there for a long time. His face throbbed. His ribs ached. He didn't feel lucky, not even a little. But what Micah didn't know was that somewhere someone had seen, and that was about to change everything. In the courtroom, things had shifted. The jury had heard Micah's voice, had seen how his hands tightened against the arms of the chair when he spoke. But none of that mattered if the evidence didn't back him up. At least, that's what the defense was counting on. Lawrence Tate stood, smoothing his suit like it was just another day at the office. He approached the jury box, holding a copy of the police report. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm. Too calm. "Let's go over the facts, shall we?" And he did. He laid out their version, line by line. Officers Daniels and Holloway were responding to an attempted robbery. The suspect was described as a young black male in a dark hoodie. Micah Turner, they claimed, matched the description. He was acting suspicious. He refused verbal commands. He tried to run. None of it was true. Micah's mother let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. The prosecutor put a hand on her arm, a silent plea for patience. The defense lawyer droned on. At no point, he said, did they use excessive force. Micah's fingers clenched into his pants. "Now, Mr. Turner," Tate said, turning toward him, "do you recall attempting to flee when approached by the officers?" "I never ran," Micah replied, his voice steady. "But you admit you were in the area where a crime had just been reported?" "I was going home. It was 10 o'clock. I had a curfew." Tate's lip twitched. "And when the officers approached you?" "I put my hands up." Frustration flickered across Tate's face. "So, when Officer Daniels wrote that you resisted arrest, that was a lie." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Tate turned back to the jury. "The officers were doing their jobs," he said. "They followed procedure. They couldn't have known if this young man was innocent." Micah wanted to shout, but his lawyer's hand on his arm kept him still. "This was an unfortunate misunderstanding," Tate said, "but it doesn't warrant destroying 2 officers' lives." But then the prosecutor stood, and everything changed.